Awesome. Okay, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's really a pleasure to moderate today's panel discussion on understanding digital platform dynamics presented by the USC Marshall Initiative on Digital Competition. And I'm Krisztian Katona, Vice President of Global Competition and Regulatory Policy at CCIA, the Computer and Communications Industry Association. And again, it's really a pleasure to be able to moderate the discussion with an exceptional panel that we've been able to put together for this today. So with that, I would like to introduce them first, and then we have a lot to talk about. So let me just introduce our panelists first. First, Wesley Gould. Wesley Gould is an assistant professor in the management and organization area at Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. Wesley's research focuses primarily on the governance of platform ecosystems and the effects of modern technology on business and society. Next to Wesley is Sokol, who is professor of law and business at the USC Gould School of Law and Marshall School of Business's marketing department, where he also is the co-director of the USC Marshall Initiative on Digital Competition. Denny's teaching and scholarship focuses on antitrust, M&A, and regulatory issues regarding digital platforms and startups. Next is Lynn, who is associate professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, where her teaching focuses on the transformative impact of emerging technologies on business and society. Her research also focuses on issues at the intersection of artificial intelligence, innovation, and antitrust, exploring how these technologies reshape business strategy, productivity, and workforce dynamics. And Zhou is associate professor at the University of Maryland's Robert H. Smith School of Business. Working with digital platforms, Bobby's research focuses on competitive marketing strategies, in particular pricing and promotion. And we look forward to hearing about some of his recent findings in that regard. So regarding our topic, digital platforms, they obviously really have been at the heart of many of the hottest debates from a global economic, legal, and policy perspective. And what's particularly striking to me today, having practiced international antitrust and competition law now for over 20 years in a number of jurisdictions, is how many of the assumptions that are being discussed and talked about and debated when we talk about digital platforms really have become almost axiomatic in the debate about digital platforms. We regularly hear terms like network effects or ecosystem lock-in or data-driven entrenchment and market tipping are really used routinely. But a key question here is, do we all agree on what these terms actually mean in practice? And how much of that consensus is actually grounded in data and empirical evidence? Or how much is being taken for granted? So today's discussion is an opportunity to step back on some of these key issues and really ask some foundational questions regarding these important points. For example, do digital markets necessarily tend towards concentration? What is the real impact of network effects? When do markets tip and when do they not? And also, how should we look at entry in digital platforms? So the answer to these questions obviously the answers are enormously important for antitrust enforcement, but also for regulatory design and innovation policy. So our hope today is that this discussion will help us re-examine some of these core assumptions and concepts. With that, let's dive in. And I would like to start with asking this very important question, which is, how much of today's narrative regarding digital platforms is supported then by empirical evidence? But also, what has changed in recent years based on our empirical understanding of these issues? Denny, let's start with you. What are your thoughts about this?
Thank you, Krisztian. So first of all, welcome and thank you, everybody, for those in person and those online. We love to have programming. We're like everybody else in Los Angeles. We're into content, and we're into Flash, and we're into beautiful people. And here we have a convergence of a number of important topics. And what motivates this is, in fact, we see a disconnect, a fundamental disconnect, which is that we see in policy circles very reductionist views about how the world works. And maybe this is understandable if, say, it was 1985 and we were just beginning to understand certain aspects of digital, maybe even 1995, where we also had a lot of important theory work. But since the year 2000, just in top journals, we've had, at this point, roughly 1,000 empirical papers across fields. A year and a half ago, I had a paper come out where we looked at 860 plus such papers, and there have been quite a number that have come out since that time. And it turns out the answers that we have today show a lot more nuance and complexity, where before we thought the answers were simple yes or no. Now the answer is largely it depends, and it depends on what exactly we're looking at, what we're focusing on, and some of the subtleties, in particular, sometimes industries and other kinds of dynamics that maybe we hadn't thought about before. And so if there's one takeaway, it's simply that we live in a very complex world, and we shouldn't be reduced to very simple type answers. And because when we do sort of fall into that trap, oftentimes we come up with policies that create, at best, unintended consequences, at worst, destroying innovation and incentives. I'll stop there and get some reactions from others.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I want to add to Danny's point that we're also in an unprecedented time where the technology evolution, the speed at which technology changes is exponential, like actually more than exponential. I just gave you a statistics, right? The AI consumption of a data center was 0.1% of total energy in the US, 0.1%. But that was last year. Do you know what is it this year? Well, actually, most recent statistics. Anyone want to guess?
2%.
10%.
Oh my gosh.
So we're talking about 100 times compute in 1 year. So this is something, we haven't experienced this kind of speed of technology change for a long time. Even railroads days, electricity days, it hasn't been this fast. So we had to be very mindful of what we're doing when we're actually implementing these policies. When we don't, when we're in the exponential hyperscaling speed and the technology at the very beginning. So I think it's just something we have to be very mindful. Nobody knows the right answer when we are going through this kind of change.
Any other initial thoughts on this?
I also wanted to add on to this discussion by highlighting the fact that we are all interconnected. Yes, we are all interconnected. Everyone in this room or online, we're either consumers, okay? We are recipients of advertising, right? Or we are sellers or buyers of products or services in major online platforms, right? Online marketplaces. So the fact that we're all interconnected means that the regulatory issues that we collectively face today is even more important as compared to relatively segregated industry, segregated markets 2 decades ago.
So I think thanks for Bobby too for bringing the conversation back to the platform a little bit, because we know that not all technology is platform and not all markets are platform, right? So actually before the session started, I was having a conversation with Brijesh and Nupa and also Jorge. Our platforms disappearing. It seems like the conversation around platforms dying down, right? Because it's subsumed by or overtaken by AI. But in a way, the platform is taken for granted in these days. It's sort of like default kind of mode of operation for technology companies, in the sense that you are providing an infrastructure for different parties to connect, even if those parties today are becoming digital agents in a way. So I just end with that.
Thank you, Wesley. We'll obviously touch on a number of these particular issues in more detail, but we have a number of kind of like core concepts and assumptions that, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, we would like to go through and walk through and hear from our panelists on how they view what is happening regarding digital platforms these days in this regard. And the first point, or the first kind of like main theme that we wanted to address, is network effects. Of course, there's a lot of discussion about different types of network effects, but it's really important to step back on this particular point as well and see kind of like how do they really, the different types of network effects, how they really shape competitive dynamics when it comes to digital platforms, and how do they interact in practice? And I would turn back to you, Bobby, on this for your initial thoughts.
Thank you, Krisztian. Again, thank you, Danny, for making this great event happen. Let me kick off our discussion on network effects. Specifically, I would like to briefly mention 4 different types of network effects. The number one network effect without any qualifiers in front is typically being interpreted as global network effects, okay? So what this means is that the more users are adopting something, the greater marginal benefit everybody who are within this group experience and enjoy. The quintessential examples of global network effects, you can think of cell phone adoption, okay? So the more people who are using cell phone, the better off you will be as part of this network, right? Or you can think about users of Facebook. So when there are more people who are on the Facebook, who are actively using the social network, right? You are better off. That's number one, global network effects and also direct network effects, okay? Your presence, your participation directly affects pretty much everybody else on this network. The second type of network I wanted to briefly mention is indirect network. So I want you to think about marketplaces, okay? For example, eBay, Amazon, or the local shopping mall. On the one side, you have buyers, you have shoppers, consumers. On the other side, you have suppliers, merchants, and so on and so forth, right? If you are able, as a platform, if you're able to attract more buyers on one side, you are definitely going to attract greater and more sellers on the other side, and vice versa, right? So this is indirect network effects. I want you to think about Amazon, eBay. I want you to think about the most popular Tyson's Mall, which is very close to us, right? And the third network effect is data network effects. Yeah. I want you to think about TikTok. What ticks, okay? What type of videos can go viral? I want you to think about Google. Why is Google search so dominant? That is because as users begin to input and interact with the engine, all of our data has been leveraged, okay, to improve their algorithm, right? And to push more relevant, more popular content to the users so that users benefit. So this is the third type of network effect, data network effects. And finally, I wanted to highlight one really interesting network effects that a lot of us are very likely to overlook, okay, in our day-to-day. And this last one is called local network effect. What does that mean? For example, let me do a very quick poll. How many of you took taxis or Ubers or Lyft to come here today? Thank you. Me too, okay? So I commuted from the Bethesda area in Maryland to DC, right? So if you think about it, do I really care about how many Uber/Lyft drivers there are in Los Angeles today? No, I don't. I care about the localized network, right? And the same thing applies if you are a user of Rover, okay, where you need somebody in your neighborhood to walk your dog, right? To take care of your dog while you are away for work. And this localized network effects turn out to be also very important when it comes to services. So I want you to think about LinkedIn for job connections in a specific region, okay? I want you to think about Instacart, okay? When you need somebody to help you with your grocery store, with your grocery shopping, right? In local supermarkets. Okay, great. I think I'm gonna stop here.
Those are a lot of things to think about.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Thank you for breaking it down when it comes to like different types of network effects. But I would just go back to you with one follow-up question, please, following up on especially the indirect network effects elements. And of course, from an antitrust enforcement and policy perspective, there's a lot of discussion about how indirect network effects can create market power. Could you break that down a little bit for us?
Absolutely. I think both Lynn and Wesley are going to talk about entry a little bit later. So I'm gonna defer some of the questions to them later. Here, I'm just gonna say that the way indirect network works and the way why indirect network effects could lead to potentially monopolistic practices is because it really solves an extremely challenging problem. And that problem is the so-called cold start or chicken and egg problem, okay? You want to start a platform, let's say, to compete with Amazon, but it's hard for you to figure out where do I really start? On the one side, how can you attract a lot of sellers, okay? Sellers won't show up if you don't have enough buyers on the other side, right? On the other hand, how can you convince your friends and neighbors to shop at your platform if you don't have enough sellers on the other side, right? So this is where indirect network effects really shine. It shines by connecting multiple sites together and leverages operational efficiency, okay, to really build this moat, if you will, right? And this is the reason why it's so hard. Once this market power has been established, it's so hard to penetrate.
Let me just push back specifically. I'm gonna focus in China. If it was really that hard, we wouldn't have seen Alibaba essentially tip in the other direction, right? It had been the quote unquote dominant firm until it wasn't. It's not even at 50% now. And this will get to some of the discussion we'll have a little bit later on differentiation of how is it that in spite of large incumbents with all of these potential advantages, that there's still opportunities for entry and for growth and for innovation. So this is, again, where there's push and pull. The answer is largely, it depends. There's one other thing, Bobby, that I'll get to, which is that you identify, I think very correctly, you looked at eBay, but you also looked at the local shopping mall. And this goes to show you that the idea of just like, oh, there's online versus offline, oftentimes has fallen apart across many different industries because you're using a omni-channel strategy that incorporates all of this and given other factors that come into play, let's say fulfillment or something else, the distinctions between online and offline are also disappearing, as are many traditional categories where we've seen in the past are breaking down, including what's marketing, what's information systems, and what's strategy. Increasingly, even on the academic side, we're all dealing with the same kinds of questions.
Just very quickly, okay, very quickly. Danny had an article with me last year, and I just wanted to quote one really interesting story to share with you all. Some of you might not know this company with the sticker PDD. Okay, if you don't, please check it out. So the US branch of PDD is called Temu. Some of you might be familiar with that branch, right? So Danny was specifically referring to this story that 5 years ago, nobody knew who the heck PDD was, okay, in China or in US. And guess what? A couple of years ago, the market capitalization of PDD exceeded that of Alibaba. Quite remarkable. So through very careful, innovation, it is still possible, okay, to actually dethrone some of those really powerful platforms.
Yeah, just following up on network effects, especially regarding data network effects, there has been a lot of discussion about not only data portability, but of course, interoperability as well. And then a lot of discussion and debate about how these potentially might mitigate, some of the data network effects. Danny, I wanted to turn to you on some of your thoughts on this, but also I was wondering if there have been any previous historical lessons, from some of the industries where this particular interoperability measures, have happened and what we have learned from those.
So this is not going to be surprising, but where we've seen it before, where it was heavily regulated, did less well with innovation. And we can think, for example, telecommunications being one of those examples. And where has it worked more effectively? Where it's been voluntary. And if we look in the digital context, so think about APIs as these kinds of ways of interfacing, and where has it worked relatively well? Number one is in fintech. We've seen a revolution in how we're able to get money to all kinds of people. Back in the day, which is to say like 5 to 10 years ago, remember when Western Union still mattered? The number one remittance payment service in the world today, not the case, largely because everyone can provide financing to the unbanked and the underserved. But not just to them, but to everybody. Think about, and there are all kinds of voluntary ways of organizing this. We can think of where a number of firms get together to set up their own kind of payment system, like a Venmo, or we can think about Zelle, or any number of individual type ways. Where we've seen this experiment go further than others is in the UK with open banking, and it seems like there have been some hiccups with some of the incumbents, but overall it seems like this kind of voluntary approach seems to be working. Another area where we see this all the time, Wesley talked about are we seeing the end of platforms? In some cases, platforms that are basically operating within these broader ecosystems where people want APIs. Sometimes there are problems, sometimes not, but typically a lot of this is done through contracts and what are the API terms? And so what are the trade-offs? On the one hand, if you're a platform, you want to have complementers. It's important to have complementers, and some industries more than others. So what is that you have to weigh? Number one, quality, and number two, innovation. And sometimes that might include some very legitimate issues like data security. You want to make sure that you don't want to be in a situation that you just allow anybody to interconnect. And so these are the kinds of tensions that emerge of how much openness do you want to have with your APIs is going to be a function of all of these different issues together. And this is where the nuance comes in. But for the most part, this tends to be voluntary, and that seems to work better than the more mandatory regimes. Public utility regulation works well for traditional public utilities, like the water utility, right? We shouldn't have more than one set of pipes. And the water utility regulation goes back literally to ancient Rome and to the city. And by that, I literally mean the city of Rome, where they would basically meter water use and you would pay for it. It tends to work less well in innovative industries, which is why you saw more on the deregulatory side, starting in the 90s in oil and gas and in telecom, for example, and even in traditional banking, because it turns out you can't really innovate effectively when it's a lot of force sharing.
Thank you, Danny. We briefly touched on entry, but I would like us to talk a little bit more about kind of like entry in platform markets. And I will turn to you, Wesley, on this first. I also wanted to see kind of like, what do you see as kind of like the main structural barriers to entering platform markets? And also, are they more technological, economic, or behavioral, somewhere else?
Yeah, so the word entry is heavy loaded, because honestly, you can think about entry in two ways. One way, which is primarily how people folks in the antitrust circle think about is entry into as a platform. So when you enter the platform market to compete with Amazon, to compete with eBay, and that really has to do with a lot of what Bobby just said about network effects, in the sense that Amazon has already accumulated such a huge network effects, which translate into sort of insurmountable advantage for a lot of these dominant platforms, and entry is made very, very difficult. And with the story of Pinduoduo, PDD in this case, they heavily differentiated at the beginning when they started their platform to differentiate from Alibaba in that they had a very different selling model. So Alibaba is a traditional kind of like e-commerce operator, but PDD said, okay, let's do social commerce. That is, make all these like your aunts and your uncles, your friends on WeChat. Let us get them involved together, get into like a group deal so that everything gets cheaper and gamify everything, and heavily targeted the lower income groups of China. So as a way to differentiate from Alibaba. So though there are ways to overcome these entry barriers due to network effects and whatnot. But I also want to remind everyone there is entry as complementers, right? To define what complementers are, the complementers are the third party entrepreneurs or these Uber drivers or these restaurants on Yelp. These are third-party businesses, organizations, or individuals whose sort of very important complementary function to the platform. So in the case of e-commerce, you're talking about sellers, right? So a very quick example I'm going to give from my own research is I actually did a lot of interview in the pros market. I probably know more about pros than vast majority of the men out there. I can confidently say that. But what happens to pros
is that differentiation?
Do you want me to see my closet? No. Anyway, so the pro market is a very traditional industry, very stagnant over time, and people have a very good sense of like what pros look like. Think about Nancy Pelosi, right? But what happened in recent 3 years is that the pro market, especially the freshwater pro market, the prices skyrocketed. Things got changed drastically due to the efforts of live streamers. Right? So live streamers who are individuals who just basically log on Twitch or whatever platforms they have and start broadcasting about whatever products they want to pick on. So these are the live streamers who came into pros, they had no knowledge about pros, but they saw that as an opportunity. They started showcasing these different products and even experimenting themselves and getting the supply from the incumbents. and promoting pros to the non-customers who are much younger women or men who have very little money. And therefore, those people can only afford these cheaper pros or the smaller pros on misfit pros, right? So all those categories became so much more popular than before, and that transformed the industry as a whole. And of course, the sales skyrocketed, but at the same time, the standards got toppled as well. So the incumbents were not happy about that. So I'll just use that example to illustrate how entry by complementers can change an entire industry. And also that's the pros and cons of a platform-enabled kind of like reemergence. Yeah.
So following up on Wesley's points on entry, a question actually to the entire panel. How should we then assess entry when what you also mentioned, boundaries among markets and in between markets have really not been that particular strict? And then you see a lot of entry in a number of different aspects and different segments of digital markets in recent years. And of course, we've already touched on a few examples, but whether it's ChatGPT, TikTok, or others, any other thoughts on this from any of you?
Or ask me in particular, or maybe Lynn.
First, I go back, throwing back to you first.
I talked for maybe then I'll put Lynn as well.
I mean, I think right now, like AI, ChatGPT, large language models are a general purpose technology. That means it's gonna apply to a variety of industries, variety of goods. And even Amazon's own statistics that only 15% of the shopping activities today is online. So that means 85% is still offline. So it is still an enormous opportunity for complementers, for special differentiations, and any type of new business that could bring that 85% online. And with artificial intelligence, other types of new technology, live streaming, et cetera, are all type of existing business, novel business models that were created because of this technology that can bring that 85% to online. So I think the market is still ripe to be disrupted. There's a lot of opportunity for these kind of activity, entrepreneurs to have activity to happen. Just like Pinduoduo example, right? That's like, you think of a very traditional online market, but through differentiation, can bring enormous market opportunities. Why does that happen? It's because 85% is still offline. So there's still a huge pie out there for platforms to use to take advantage of it. So when I think that through the next wave of technology, revolution such as large language models or artificial intelligence in general, and all of these, I think is all game potentially. I think I expect to be a lot of entries again in the next 5 years, and maybe consolidation after that. For me, this is where we're at the beginning of internet eras again. All these, pet.com in 2000, we're gonna see a ton of entries, and how many will survive is a different question.
I'll give two examples in two different kinds of industries. So one is AI reduces the cost of production massively. So if you look at the number of, say, small music groups that are able to produce and get online easily, or frankly, video game programmers that are solo producers of video games or even small producers of video games, cost of production has gone down significantly. And so we have a lot of entry. And that's great. That's exactly the kind of story that Lynn's talking about. And we have a lot more creativity that way. The other way I want us to think about it along the same lines is the very idea of what it means to do search is very different now than just 2022. Because now quite a number of people are using AI to quote unquote do search. The same way we used to think of Xeroxing or Kleenex, we think of something called Google, but how many people are actually using Google versus some AI tool to do search? We're seeing this transformation. It's happening very, very quickly. But I'm actually going to focus on entry in a different way, which is that if we get back to something that Bobby talked about, which is data. So it turns out companies can utilize data, and to a certain extent, more data doesn't actually lead to better results. But how do you get the data? The chicken and egg problem that we heard about earlier. So it turns out you sometimes need to get people to give you the data, but another way is you get people to sell you the data. And it turns out data brokers are a huge business worth billions of dollars every single year. So if you're a consumer-facing company, very quickly, it's not just that you make the data, so to speak, you buy the data.
Yeah, following the data effect, I want to add that data network effects maybe have two different one as well. There's a local data network effects and a global data network effects, right? So the ChatGPT, the Google world wants to have global everyone's behavior and then target, target globally for everyone, right? But then there's also local data network effects. Like if I just care about medicine or drug discovery, I don't care about what you did on searches, right? I cared about the patent databases. I cared about all the scientific knowledge that has accumulated on that particular medical advance. And those data, it will be very particular, it will be very different, and training on them will be very different. Utilizing them will be very different than what you do in global data search. Like just think about acronyms, right? In medicine, three-letter acronyms are different across different industries, right? So just that example just shows you that there's even data. Just because you release all data to the world, it may be very much value to Google, but maybe little value to a drug discovery company, for example.
I also wanted to quickly add to Lynn's point by saying that if you think about a couple of weeks ago, there was this closed door investors conference hosted by Sokol Capital, right? They were predicting what's the next wave of the hottest startups, right? They mentioned exactly what Lynn was referring to. You know, those specialized AI applications that targets very specific sectors of the economy. They are going to be the next wave of unicorns.
Yeah, so I think what we see is truly many of these basic concepts and key issues are deeply interrelated. So when we talk about one, obviously it brings up whether it's entry, whether it's network effects. Obviously, we touch on a number of related issues as well. But one other point that has come up briefly before, and then I think you mentioned, Danny, something about competition through differentiation. So especially from an antitrust policy and enforcement perspective, I wanted to see what your thoughts are on how antitrust should conceptualize differentiation, competition through differentiation.
So we have a lot of push and pull in antitrust. On the one hand, if you're a plaintiff, you want to define the market as narrowly as possible, sometimes to the point where it just doesn't make economic sense. On the other hand, we also have another tradition within antitrust that we look at cluster markets, where we say we're not going to look at any one little market, we're going to look at in general. So for example, in a traditional supermarket merger, we're looking at supermarkets themselves. We're not looking necessarily at unique products within supermarkets, except for the times when we are looking at unique products in supermarkets. And so we have this fundamental tension for differentiation. I actually want to go in a purely digital space, though I like my organic lettuce just like everybody else. I want to talk about dating apps for a second. So what does differentiation look like, and how do you get past data barriers to entry? Because you have that plus the traditional direct network effects that Bobby was talking about. So let's imagine you want to go on a date. So you have many dating apps to choose from, but all of which are slightly different. So you can go on one that you're looking for marriage, like an eHarmony, or you can go on a website where, say, women ask men, which is, I understand, Bumble. Or you could say, actually, I'm a man looking for a man, and then we have Grindr. Or then you have one Tinder, which I understand is dating, in quotes. All of these are differentiated. They're all technically still dating apps. What's the market, right? And this is the challenge that we're talking about, that are these all really in the same market? Are they not in the same market? And I suspect that there are many more apps. I mean, one of my favorite to look at is shoddy.com, or just shoddy for those looking at the actual app itself, because you have like drop-down menus like I am, and then you sort of put it in like Parsi looking for other Parsi, Parsi looking for Hindu. I mean, like, it's great. And are these all the same apps? Are in the same market? I don't know. Krisztian, it's tough.
It really is. It sounds so hard to argue with that.
Did you know so much about different types of dating apps?
Any other thoughts on differentiation? In particular, perhaps, Wesley, I wanted to turn to you, like from your perspective, does kind of like differentiation then change the dynamics of innovation competition in digital markets, or any other thoughts on this?
So network effects are a double-edged sword, in the sense that if a large platform accumulates a huge amount of network effects, it actually becomes less flexible to differentiate because you've already established what we call the core interaction that all the customers perceive you to be. So for LinkedIn or Uber, the core interaction is to get on the website and view your friends' professional updates. But all of a sudden, LinkedIn wants to do something else, like more social relationships, be very difficult for LinkedIn to pivot that way. So in a way, differentiation is very hard for dominant platforms, but easier for starters in a way. There's another layer of differentiation, going back to my early comments, differentiation at the sub-platform level, which is amongst the complementers or the users in a way. That's much easier to do. So platforms oftentimes create these new algorithms to encourage certain types of complementers to sell certain types of products. And they oftentimes do this by kind of like promoting certain types of products. So for gaming platform, for example, if you want more first-person shooter games, then what Sony and Xbox would do is to buy out one of the developers and start developing more of these games and sending a signal to the rest of the field that, okay, let's differentiate from Xbox by having more types of this type of games. So these are common strategies used by platforms at the sub-platform level.
So this, go ahead.
Oh, I'm saying for differentiations, it's actually really important to see that differentiate actually ultimately build a moat for the business, right? So there could be a lot of differentiations out there, right? You could create the biggest, greatest app, but then you don't differentiate in the sense that you don't differentiate and you don't have a moat, then the platform can simply just swallow you by the big one, right? So you had to be a sustainable differentiation by which you have proprietary data or other ways for you to differentiate. Just give you an example, right? Your iPhone flashlight, right? Was a third-party app before. It was the most popular third-party app before in the whole world or iPhone system, right? Now it's native app, right? So even though it's vastly successful, it's differentiated, right? It's very popular, but in the end, when Apple system decide to native that app, there's no way you can compete against that. There's no way. They have access to proprietary software, hardware, their entire software, hardware stack in the iOS system, right? So then you simply can't do it. And I see the same type of dynamics playing out in the large language model world, the ChatGPT world. You build a differentiated product no one else has using OpenAI's API, and you could be the next flashlight. So you got to be careful about what type of differentiation you are, that ultimately build that competitive moat.
In a way, the dominant platform is sort of for integrating or bundling these complementary products.
Exactly. Yeah, that's going to be a big deal because OpenAI has a lot of power, right? So there are 85% opportunities there, but you had to be careful which one give you sustainable competitive advantage.
So two important things to noting is look how little time it took from OpenAI to be an app to transform itself into a platform.
Exactly.
So that tells us that actually competition can happen very, very rapidly. Number two is there are many situations where bundling and tying are actually pro-competitive. The difficult thing is trying to distinguish between the pro-competitive versus the anti-competitive, and a lot of this is going to be very fact-specific.
I also wanted to very quickly piggyback on some of the points that were raised collectively by our panel. I wanted to highlight that over 70% of the US GDP is service-based instead of hardware products-based, right? So whenever you are thinking about innovation, differentiation, I want to encourage everybody to think about where you can create values for your customers, okay? For example, you don't have to necessarily compete on the quality of the coffee beans themselves. You can think about delivery speed, right? You can think about online ordering system. You can think about bundling coffee with whatever other services or other food or drinks that your customers actually crave for, right? So I want to encourage you to think about all of those services that you can create, either complement or substitute the current offerings, right? Instead of focusing only on the hardware, the product, the physical products themselves.
So I think this leads us to one of the very important and basic questions that we hear a lot about, which is when do markets tip? And especially, when do they tip? And then when the markets do not tip? I think it's really important to see those differences and nuances when it comes to digital markets. And for that, I would turn back to you first, Lynn, on your thoughts on kind of like what are the necessary conditions when it comes to talking about digital markets and tipping in this space?
Yeah, so when we talk about market tipping, usually we mean that a incumbent have accumulated substantial advantage such that they are the dominant player, make it very difficult for other people to survive in the same market or for a new entry to come in, right? That's what we generally talk about tipping, that basically winner take all or winner take most scenario, right? So generally, when you have a tipping point where a single or a couple company had pretty much dominated the entire market, usually we're talking about enormous scaling effect, like basically huge network effects already there, such that it's really difficult for an incumbent to come in to overcome that enormous network effects already there, right? But network effect is only a necessary, but not a sufficient option, right? You can see if the network effects is really the only thing, right? MySpace would have been the dominant Facebook.
Yes.
Have you guys know MySpace, right? We're in a room that we know MySpace, right? Right. So then they would be MySpace, right? So we do see this kind of network effects eventually sometime can be overcome by other entrants in the world, right? So how do you prevent others from coming in? How do you ensure that your network effect is sustainable, right? Number one is create a very high switching cost, right? How do I make sure that even though you could switch to a different platform, I don't want to, because all of us are on the same platform and we're chatting with each other on WhatsApp, whatever other. Danny, I talk on WhatsApp, that's why I mentioned WhatsApp on this platform. So you don't want to move to another platform despite that you could, because the switching cost is so high, right? So when you are creating in a world where switching cost is very high, that could prevent you, that could actually sustain that market power, okay? But then I also want to caution that even though you have a very high switching cost, right? Technology changed. Technology adoption, new technology becomes available. You say, oh, but maybe I don't want to chat anymore. Maybe I'll just video with each other all the time. So you eliminate the possibility of needing to chat text at all. Maybe in the future it'll be AR, VR glasses you'd wear and I want to chat to, Danny, I want to talk to Wesley. I simply put a little, click there. So eliminate the possibility or the need to chat. And then that can dramatically change the landscape of a platform. And then that's kind of, why do I bring this example, right? I think we are currently in that world where technology change can happen so quickly, so dramatically, that some of the existing platforms we have today thinking like, oh, this is the dominant platform, in a year or two may not necessarily be the platform, right? Just like chat, OpenAI is an example, right? Like it literally is the fastest growing platform, right? It reached the number of users that typical Netflix 5 years to get. It got there in like a few days, something like that. It was crazy, right? So why does that happen? Because it provided a new way for people to connect, new way to get our needs met, right? Then in that sense, then the entire dynamics of network is blown up. And again, we're in an exponential curve. At the beginning of that exponential, we're not even at the inflection point yet, right? It's really going quickly. That means this market dynamics for platform can change very quickly. So if you ask me, do they have sustainable power? I says, to what extent the technology is changing is for me the most important thing at the current point in time.
Any other thoughts or comments on market tipping in digital markets?
A very quick addition to what Lynn said. We have to keep in mind that most of these platforms face a fundamental trade-off between openness and exclusivity. Because on one hand, the platform wants to be open in order to expand access. Think about Zoom, right? Zoom grew very quickly because it's very easy for people to use it, don't have to log in, just use a browser. But on the other hand, platforms do want to be exclusive in order to monetize. For example, Zoom cannot easily monetize millions of the individual users. It has to go through the corporate accounts. So there is a fundamental trade-off right here in terms of how much the platform can benefit from being open versus being exclusive.
I think that, oh, go ahead.
No, you finish.
Oh, I'm just saying that open and close thing is a big deal in AI world. Like, OpenAI is being a closed platform, Hugging Face and others are being open platform. And I think all the stuff we learn about open and close is gonna play an enormous role in the next couple of years or month, when we're thinking about open and closed platforms.
I guess the only additional wrinkle that I want to throw in is sometimes you have a company that in its core service continues to have a large market share. That might be the first place that we start looking. But that doesn't mean that there isn't competition, that it's a winner take all, because every other company, whether differentiated or not, is nibbling, and that's enough to basically constrain those traditional companies from doing all kinds of things. And we see that, and it's easiest to find that particularly in smaller jurisdictions, let's say Singapore with regards to rideshare. And I mention this only because Wesley lived a number of years in Singapore and taught there at INSEAD. I'm sorry, I shouldn't mention the prior school because then, but
Why shouldn't you?
But the point is, we have a quote unquote dominant firm, and yet we have a lot of differentiation that nibbles away to keep the so-called dominant platform from basically being dishonest.
Right.
And that's something also to consider, because otherwise we'd say like, oh my God, we've had the same monopoly on Windows for longer than I've been out of law school. And we'd say like, is that necessarily a problem? No, not really, because we have other ways of disciplining Microsoft, for example, for Microsoft Word.
Yeah, one other thing that I think you just touched upon before was complementary assets. And following up on that particular point, I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about, like what we mean when we talk about complementary assets in the antitrust context, and of course, how that also differs from unrelated or ancillary assets as well. Wesley?
Yeah, but thank you for the question. I'm not an antitrust person, so I rely on Danny to fill in the gap on that one. But in terms of complementary, I offered definition early on, is really any individual organizational business that offers a complementary service that enhances the value of the platform's proposition as a whole. So if you think about drivers on Uber, they offer complimentary service. Restaurants like Yelp, they offer complimentary service by providing food for the customers. So I think these are very, very important components, and there is a fundamental kind of like tug of war between, say, the platform and the complementaries, right? In a way, because platform want to make the complementaries work. Think about drivers on Uber, but drivers want to maximize their own kind of like profitability by earning more money in fewer hours. So in a way, it has to deal with platform governance, right? So the topic of platform governance is very essential to platform, all platforms, because you have to set the rules for behavior and also for commission, for profit sharing. We have a lot of concern from all over the world, practitioners, policymakers, on whether platforms are mistreating their workers, on Uber or on DoorDash, for example. But at the same time, Uber and the DoorDash, they are operating on a very thin profit margin. So that's definitely a constant discussion that we are having right now. Yeah.
I'll just add that how to deal with between platform and complementary is complex, as Wesley says. But I'll add yet another aspect, which is sometimes if you're a large platform, it makes sense to have third-party complementers. Sometimes you have your own product and third parties competing. Sometimes you may want to bring it completely in-house and have it as a purely integrated product where you had been open, now you might get closed for certain kinds of features. And there are many business strategies why you might choose at various times any of these three, and there are nuances to all of them, but these are the three basic questions that we might have. But a lot of time, it's about creating the value. And so you don't do it unless you're going to somehow create value. A lot of the kind of policy discussion we get is about different aggrieved groups saying how much of the value they get to capture. And I think this is, Wesley, what you were really getting at. Yeah. That's distinct from the antitrust question, which is simply, are consumers better off? And so this is where the push and pull tends to come in from a different perspective, which is, what is it that we're trying to maximize, and how much do we feel the need to regulate or to intervene with enforcement that basically creates almost a quasi-regulatory function, versus how much do we enforce when there's a true problem, versus how much do we just sort of leave for parties to work out? And the answer depends, again, largely on the kind of behavior that we're looking at, the kind of complements we're looking at. But overall, asset specificity and complementarities are a positive thing, with certain exceptions.
Sorry, just very quickly, and I think this is such an important point that you mentioned. We gotta expand our vision beyond whether the consumers benefit or not. So I'll give you a quick example from my research. I did a lot of work with this domestic helper platform in Singapore. So in the context of this labor platform, the consumers, like employers, like you and me, were hiring these women from the Philippines and Indonesia who work in our households. So we are the consumers and they are the complementers. So if we exclusively focus on how much we benefit, then we're basically neglecting the welfare of this hugely vulnerable group of population, worker population, right? So from my research, I actually find that even if we implement this rating system that allows the workers to rate their employers, this rating system faces huge hurdles, because on one hand, the employers don't like to be rated due to the social disparity, the power disparity. On the other hand, the workers, surprisingly, they don't want to use it either, because they're afraid of backlash and potential retaliation and getting kicked out of the country. So that's just one example to throw out there to kind of like convince everyone to try to expand the vision beyond just what we define as consumers.
Although, Wesley, I want to just sort of riff on this slightly, which is that you're basically talking about a platform market. There was a, say, 10-year period that we called these, I blame you, Jean-Thibault Nobel laureate, two-sided markets. In fact, oftentimes it has more than two sides. You've identified literally three sides on the market. And the problem is, when you kept on thinking about it as a two-sided market, then we had this tunnel vision.
Right.
So we should look at all the different sides of the market holistically, because they all seem to matter. Although our Supreme Court says that's only true in some kinds of platform markets and not others, which only goes to show you, welcome to the world we live in.
Thank you for that. That really brings us to a really key and very important question that I think we've already touched on to a certain degree, but how to grow platforms. And I think this obviously has so many different elements and aspects. But Robbie, I'm turning to you first on this one. Can you tell us a little bit about like how platforms compete on innovation, also how that differs potentially from price and output?
Absolutely. The number one lesson is try your best to not compete on price. Okay, try your best to focus on creating new values for your customers. Okay, now back to the magic number of 3. I wanted to share 3 fundamental principles of how to help your business grow into a platform. Okay, the number 1, I'm a true believer of the wisdom of the crowd. So as a result, I believe in opening up to third parties. I'm gonna give you a really simple but powerful examples of opening up to third parties. Let's say I saw a bottle of water right over there, okay? Let's say I'm trying to create a platform business based on a simple bottle of water. How can I open this up to third parties, okay? And here's one potential idea and application. I'm gonna call up the top 10 nutritional supplements firms in the US. I wanted to say, hey, are you guys interested in offering one little free packets of nutrients, complementary nutrients that can be put into the bottle of water, okay? And if you say yes, I'm gonna be able to offer this bottle of water either free or at minimum costs to my clients, to my customers, the individual end customers, okay? So this is an application of opening door to third parties, okay? I wanted to leverage the power, the creativity, the expertise of everybody who's smarter than I am. And the quintessential example of the success story of opening up to third parties is what? iOS App Store, right? That's probably the number 1 reason why Nokia is no longer the number 1 cell phone manufacturer today, right? although we'll have all experienced how awesome their feature phone was 20 years ago, right? Number two, I want to encourage you all to try to connect your customers and create values for them. By saying connect, I don't mean Samsung's refrigerator dating, okay? That didn't work, okay? I also didn't, I didn't want to make fun of him, but Sir Richard Branson introduces an in-flight flirting system, right? At Virgin Atlantic, which turned out to be a disaster as well. That's what I meant by connecting your customers, okay? When I say connecting your customers, I'm thinking about, for example, okay, for Tesla, which is not the most loved brand right now, they could encourage the online forum discussion about how to unlock certain features of the vehicle, right? How to fix small issues of the vehicle so that the ownership experience can become more positive. I'm thinking about Amazon, for example, okay, to create local book clubs based on the Kindle shared interests in a certain zip code, for example, right? So that's the second principle, connecting your customers. And finally, I wanted to very briefly touch upon one last principle, which is connecting your customers' customers. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So what does that mean? I want you to think about the success story of OpenTable. Do you guys remember what OpenTable started out with? OpenTable was an accounting software for restaurant owners. Okay? Literally, it was probably one of the very successful accounting software for restaurateurs, right? Then they figured out that, look, why don't I reach out to my clients, my customer, which are restaurant owners, clients, which are what we are, right? Individual diners. Mm-hmm. And let's create a centralized sort of reservation booking type of platform so that I can facilitate the transaction, the search amongst my clients' clients. And collectively, those three rules, opening up to third parties, connecting your customers, connect with your customers' customers, okay, can really help you to turn into your product or services into a more platform-like enterprise.
Thank you, Bobby. Danny, I think I would turn to you because you have done a lot of work on merger activity in digital markets and also focusing on tech startups or so. A couple of questions on this would be, first, what have you seen? Why has been kind of like the main model for tech startups being more, like acquisition and perhaps in that regard than IPOs? But also, what does it mean for the broader kind of like innovation ecosystem and market structures in that regard?
So this is a great question. So thank you, Sarbanes-Oxley. We now see fewer IPOs in general. So if you're going to have, again, unintended consequences, understood all the accounting scandals and why we have a lot of compliance costs. But one of the other aspects is simply the amount of funding before we go public is much more significant. So we have a lot more unicorns because we go public at a much later stage than we used to before. So at this point, it's all about acquisition. But most of the time, you're going to do an acquisition. Why? Because of the complementarities that we were talking about earlier. So we've now had a series of empirical papers. Every single one shows that basically both the startups need the larger tech platforms, and I say this goes beyond just the so-called Magnificent Seven that we actually look at the acquisition side. If we look at who the acquirers are, it's beyond that group. And within that group, not all of them have the same kind of acquisition appetite. But number two, it turns out, that's exactly what venture capitalists are for the most part looking to. It's like, who do we think we can sell to? How can you basically fit into somebody else's portfolio, into their ecosystem? That's a win-win oftentimes. The empirical work, at least in published papers, in the serious peer-reviewed journals, that's what they show. If I can self-preference. Bobby, your colleague and my co-author at the University of Maryland at Ginger Gin has a series of papers on this, and I encourage people to read her work largely.
Thoughts on that? Perhaps I would close with one particular question focusing on AI to you, Lynn, because you've already talked a little bit about AI, kind of like the use of AI for platform success. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of like how AI in that regard would significantly influence what you see in the foreseeable future, competitive dynamics for digital platforms.
Yeah. So I see the general space in AI are building a new type of platforms. So if you think about the AI compute stack, we go from chips, right? Basically your GPUs of the world, NVIDIA, TPU to Google, Amazon's getting to that, inferentia, and then you have the cloud computing space, AWS, Azure, and Google's GCP, right? Google Cloud, okay? And then you have the applications, right? Models, right? OpenAI's model, the DeepSeek, right? All the stuff, the model. And then you have the application on top. But all the applications are really paying through that inverted funnel. And if you look at the firm that occupy every single piece of that stack, right? Who's occupying chips and cloud and the foundation models, like the OpenAI's GPT, the foundation model, cloud is a foundation model, and then you have application on top, right? Excluding application, right? Who have all the three layers built up already, right? Currently, there are two firms have achieved that, and that'll be a new platform in the future, in my opinion, right? Google has done chips, cloud, and models, right? They got TPU, they got the GCP, and then with the acquisition of WITS a couple months ago, it's all building up that stack, right? Microsoft has already also completed that stack, right? They have the chips now, they have the Azure, and then they have the built foundation model, either collaboration with OpenAI or their own proprietary models, right? So basically, all these companies are building that stack, and once that stack's completed, that will be, in my opinion, the platform of the future. In a sense, all the application we talk about, 85% was not, activity has not gone online yet. That is opportunity these stack players are trying to achieve, right? And I think once that stack is created, it's actually formidable, right? So that's a deeply vertically integrated stack. And this is not a stack where, think about Ubers of the world, where they don't really need a heavy infrastructure investment, right? I build a software, match riders with drivers, right? Amazon, right? They don't produce goods, they just kind of shifting goods around, right? But these stacks are much different, right? These stacks are heavily capital intensive. They're like kind of almost like railroads in the world, right? So they have huge infrastructure investment. And once that stack is built, I think that is far more formidable than many of the digital platforms we see today. Because digital platform ultimately, marginal cost is zero. The marginal cost in AI is not zero because we had to pay chips, we had to pay for API, we had entire cloud computing, costs. So in that world, we're kind of going between the physical and the digital world economics, and that's going to be pretty interesting to watch out for. So I think once those kind of platform reaches maturity, OpenAI obviously doing that. Remember, they just hired John Ives from Apple. Why? They're building the stack, the physical stack, controlling from entry point to your application. So whoever owns that entirety of stack is going to have enormous market power.
Thank you, Lynn. To wrap up, I actually wanted to ask each of our panelists for a very short, perhaps less than 30-second concluding thought. But I'm also looking at Danny, if we have perhaps time for one or two questions, if there is any from the audience.
Sure. Why don't we let the audience ask a question or two, and then we can do a concluding thought.
If anyone has any questions.
I think each of us, thank you for this wonderful discussion. Each of us has alluded in some way, I suppose, to antitrust or competition policies. I think this question is not unfitting. So I think the general point is well taken that, in this still what seems to be the nascent stage of rapid development and deployment of AI and things like that, you don't want regulations that can stifle innovation and growth. But I think, a number of us are perhaps interested in what the policy world is going to look like. We do, at a high level, I suppose, antitrust policy has to do with collusion, the standards are somewhat well established. Mergers can kind of see what things tend to look like over there. I think a lot of this discussion in terms of the regulatory uncertainty has to do with monopolization and those sorts of practices. We do hear regulatory horror stories of, the over-regulation stifling innovation. But it's also the case that the existence of a rival does not necessarily point to evidence of an optimal competitive landscape. So in terms of some guiding principles for regulators who are going to regulate, besides saying don't do too much and don't try to adopt maybe a somewhat of a light touch approach, what sort of general regulatory principles do you think competition policymakers should look at in trying to determine what's a good policy and what's not in terms of monopolistic practices in digital platforms?
First thing I'd say is actually understand the markets and the players in the markets, because a lot of times,
It's recorded.
yeah.
Good point.
Yeah, I'll just say, we don't hear from enough people in industry. And even that is a chicken and egg problem, because sometimes people in industry are scared to tell the truth, because the moment that they start talking, all of a sudden everyone says, now let's investigate them. And this is the worst of both worlds. And this is frankly why we have industry associations to say, actually, the reason why we exist is because the moment a company says something on its own, they've got a target on their back. But there's a certain amount of courage, I think, to listen to industry broadly, and to understand that industry is also nuanced and there are different players within industry. But part of it is to really dig down and to really tease out some of this, and some of that requires technical skills. And it's typical. So there are certain authorities that do it better, that really try to understand how technology works, and others that employ the kind of people who learn about technology by reading, say, the New York Times or the equivalent, or maybe who have read a little too much of, I don't know, The Far Side back in the day. And that's how they got their technology. But you really have to understand the technology to get to good policy.
I also wanted to quickly add a couple of related points to what Danny has mentioned. Number one, I think it would be really helpful for the regulators to very clearly articulate and clarify its objectives, both in the short run and in the long run, right? So what's your objective in the next 5 years, next 10 years? You cannot sacrifice, for example, the long run potential benefits, right, with some relatively short-sighted, really stringent regulatory policies.
I think it benefits a firm to know exactly what regulators are thinking too, right? So they will, okay, this is allowed, this is not allowed. Now my business model becomes a lot clearer, right? So I think it's beneficial for everyone in the room to know what the long-term goals are. And I think it's also important to realize that this is a nascent technology in a sense. A lot of things will change. So regulators should also be nimble. Right? You should have a policy, but don't afraid to cannibalize that policy and change it. Because we are all learning, experimenting, the industry are learning, experimenting, and regulators should be also learning, experimenting to see what works and what doesn't work. So obviously you cannot just change law a lot, right? But through our research, hopefully, our research collectively and many others can help inform these kind of policy. Oh, by the way, this kind of intervention seemed to work, and maybe we should deploy it at large.
Just very quickly, I love the point Lynn just made. Yeah. I'm a marketer, right? So I work with researchers in the space of advertising. And for the longest time, MMM is so considered as a gold standard for evaluating the advertising performances, right? Not anymore. Experimentation is now considered the gold standard, right? We have control group, we have treatment group. Does this really work, right? So back to Lynn's point, I really, appeal to the regulators to also stay nimble, to stay humble, right? Let's experiment, right? Let's look at what other jurisdictions have done. EU, China, Japan, South Korea, and so on and so forth, right? Let's learn from each other and see collectively, can we, come up with better, more balanced policies.
Well, which is also helpful to have all the divergent policy only for short run, right? Let's we can experiment, EU has different thing, UK has different thing, China has different thing, maybe US has different thing. But maybe use that as opportunity to learn what works and what doesn't work and quickly converge onto a global standard.
Exactly.
Very quickly, competition happens obviously between platforms, and that's the focus of a lot of us, but also competition happens within platforms as well. A lot of markets, inevitably due to network effects, you are not going to have too many platforms, but within platforms, the competition can also produce very good outcomes for the participants. Yeah.
Thank you, Wesley, and thank you all for this great discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.